I'm Cordelia Anderson, and I'm here with the Joshua Center, and this is the third part of talking about the history of child sexual abuse prevention and initiatives. This is the time when we talk about the future, where we're at, where we're going, what are the best guesses at this point. So I want to start by saying what I feel like is obvious, and yet we're just not there, and that is we must believe that prevention is really possible. And I talk to many of my colleagues who I know don't really believe that, and many people out in the community who don't really believe that. And if we are fighting for social justice and social change, we ultimately have to believe that this is possible. We've seen major social change in other areas, and we need to believe it is possible with child sexual abuse, that we can get to a spot where however many years in our future, we're looking back going, we cannot believe that there was all this time where our children were treated in these ways, that we had this kind of vulnerability, and that so many people were taught to behave in harmful sexual ways and coercive ways. So part of that connects back to we also need to fund it. If we don't really believe it's possible or we minimize the value of it, we don't invest in it. We invest in this country in the after effects. We invest in an industrialized prison complex. We invest in services to treat the harm. We invest in research, perhaps not as much as we should in any of those areas, but all of those get more than actually what we're doing to prevent it in the first place. The other thing is that as we grow the services to respond to the harm that are desperately needed in all communities, we have a caution. And that caution is not to be so invested in growing our services that we're not all looking at our part in preventing the need for us to exist. That ideally, if we've prevented this, we don't need to keep having more services to investigate, to treat, to incarcerate, but rather that we really have made significant gains in prevention. Another piece that I feel like we've become better at over the years, and yet we tend to get selective with using it as we want to meet our current beliefs, is how we use data and research. Because there are plenty of policies that get passed that are based on somebody's passion or the latest visible case, as opposed to on the research and best practice. And we've got to have times when we're developing programs and we're trying out new things that we don't have the research on yet because it's new, but ultimately looking at having the support to both grow new programs, to expand things that are known to work, to research them and evaluate them are all part of what needs to keep happening in the future and not get cut short, but based on data, not just based on our best guesses. We've had plenty of years where that's all we had, but now we have research and data to build on. Another area which tends to be talked about more in the sex trafficking and anti-sex trafficking work is how do we counter demand? And where that fits with this is when we look at children as legitimate sexual commodities for our use or for our profit, then we're not following the money enough to look at why is there so much demand for children to sexually abuse, to be used in child sexual abuse images, or as it's legally called child pornography, to be used for sex trafficking, to be used for individuals, individual gain, to meet an individual's need. Why is there such a demand for children as sexual objects and commodities, and how do we counter that demand in systemic ways? And we need to invest in how we counter demand in the same way that we've invested in response systems. We also need to highlight what's working. Certainly highlight the evidence-based practices, but there are some very promising practices that haven't had the benefit of having the funding to have that kind of research behind them. And people need to be inspired by possibilities as well as gems of practice. And when we know more about that and we highlight that more, that creates more opportunity to learn from each other, to improve our practice, and to perhaps find the resources to grow things that are working and see if what's working in community A works in community B, and so on, or on a broader scale. The other issue there is to continue to do the very hard work of addressing the intersections between oppression, to look at all of the different ways these issues connect, and how we do not only individual change, but organizational and systemic change. Before I move on from that, I just want to say that I'm in many organizations that say, well, I've heard this so many times, that if we talk about racial justice, isn't that getting away from our mission of preventing child sexual abuse or sexual violence? And yet kind of pause to say, well, it's totally connected. It's totally connected for the difference in how a survivor of color feels, or a survivor from any other marginalized community, or how a person who perpetrates is treated depending on their identity, or how our services are geared up, or our education is geared up, or how I act and react as a bystander in the community, and just the intersection of oppression. And when I come into a service, I don't come in just as LGBTQ or T. I don't come in as just my race or cultural identity, my gender identity. I come in with a combination of all of these things. So when we look at how we're working together, and how we're building community, and how we're working to truly address a range of needs, we need to look at this. And for white leaders in that field, that's also looking at our privilege. And for everyone, we have privilege. And we need to look at what our privileges are so that we're using them in the best way to make change. So as an able-bodied person, what that's like when I can walk away and not recognize the challenges that is for somebody that is different from me. All the way. How do we look at our power and privilege? How do we look at the intersection between oppressions, and how that feeds into the vulnerability of all children for sexual abuse? And that leads into the issue of survivor leadership. We've had courageous, powerful, and strong leaders who are survivors of sexual abuse throughout the work that's been going on. But what Me Too has shown us is what it happens when we tap in to the movement possibilities by engaging all of those that have been harmed. Not everybody has to speak up, and not everybody has to speak up publicly at all. That's not what I'm saying. But in our field, one of the things that happened is, for many of us who are survivors of different type of violence over the years, it was like choosing between, do I say I'm a survivor or do I say I'm a professional? Because if I say a survivor, then we kind of get marginalized into, oh, you're a survivor, so then you have a bias. Or you're a survivor and we understand trauma, so maybe you can't really handle the work and be a leader. Or you're a survivor and there's sort of a patronizing response to that you're a survivor, but are you really a professional? And then for the professionals to feel like they have to hide that in order to really say, yeah, I'm a professional. We have to get beyond that as we move into the future, and to engage that broader community. And some of you certainly may remember a time where in the breast cancer, you couldn't say breast. We didn't want to fund research. People that were living with breast cancer felt like they couldn't say it out loud. People that knew and loved people with breast cancer didn't feel like they could talk about it because they had to protect that person's privacy. And now you think about the marches en masse, the demand for more research, the demand for more different kinds of treatment, the ability to say, I'm a survivor of breast cancer with no shame. It's just a reality, and it's only part of who I am, and I'm more than that. And there's people that it affects their whole life, and there's people that get over that and are no longer living with that. And there's lots of people deeply affected because they know and love somebody with breast cancer. There's a parallel to that in child sexual abuse, that in the future, I hope that we are much better able to have a safe space, free of shame, for people who are survivors to speak up and be supported. And not only that, if you really want to get at ripple effects, we would not only be shocked, as we have been with Me Too, at how many survivors there are, but if you add all of us who know and love survivors, it's a lot of people. And if all of those people demanded social justice and social change and an investment in not only treating the harm but preventing it, we would have a much stronger movement. And I hope to see that in the future as we go forward. Right alongside of that, a tricky question for us right now, we'll see where we are at in 10 years or 20 years, is how we're really dealing with authentic and meaningful accountability for those who have committed harm. And recognizing there's different degrees of harm, so there's not one right way for all of that. But we are a society right now that's really stuck in thinking the main way to deal with that is our criminal justice system. There is time and a need for our criminal justice system, and that's why we fight for improvements and we fight for understanding in that. But that also cannot be the only answer. If you think through a public health lens or a social justice lens, we also need to say, as a parent right now of a child who had a sexual behavior problem or developed a problem, whether that's online with child sexual abuse images, whether that's something that I know they did to another child, for many parents that's a horrifying thought. Because if I reach out for treatment, is that person going to feel like they need to report them? Is my child going to be registered as a sex offender? If I want to get my child help, where do I go? And yet, for prevention, again, I go back to we want to prevent the development of sexually harmful behavior. As a parent, I want to be telling my child not only what they need to do to be safer and not be harmed from sexual abuse and all other kinds of harms, but I also want them to do no harm. And I want them to know that when they have, instead of saying, you didn't do that, did you, honey? That a key part of growing up in a healthy way is taking responsibility for the impact of our behavior on others and knowing how to take accountability. And our field needs to grapple with, is there space in our movement for those who have committed past acts of sexual aggression, sexual coercion, sexual harm, to admit what they did, to take responsibility, to do what they need to show that they have changed and will not harm again to the best that we can look at that? Is there a space for them in the movement? How do we learn more from people who have done harmful acts, perhaps historically and who have never been charged, but really want to take accountability? And how do we take accountability now? Another part of that is this is tough work. And there's been a lot of attention over the decades. It's shifted from self-care to, again, an individual strategy, to the ethical responsibility of organizations that work with trauma to understand secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, and the organizations having a responsibility to keep people healthy. Because we want people healthy doing this work. We want people to stay charged. We want people to stay passionate. We want people to keep their outrage. We want people to be able to stay in this field for a long time and not feel like they need to leave it because it's too stressful. It's too overwhelming. Very often, this is not only the nature of the work, but perhaps the health and well-being of our organizations and the broader society and how they deal with this. But as we go forward, we need to have a lot of attention to secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, and doing all we can to keep the leaders in our field and the emerging professionals in the field healthy and going forward. Another challenge of the future is I think there's judgments from the grassroots activists against the mainstream organizations and academic, and there's judgments from the academic and mainstream organizations against the grassroots and the activists. We need each other. We need to come together. We need to build better bridges. We can't all do everything. We each have a different role. So we need to be hearing about what each other's doing. We need to be challenged by each other's perspectives. We need to be continuing to build bridges. We desperately need new leaders. Sitting here right now in 2019, we have been, and certainly over these next 5 and 10 years, we will be losing more and more of the people that have been leaders in this field who are at a phase of their life where they're moving in from working full-time into some form of retirement and in some form of re-engagement. We desperately need new leaders that are coming up in this field, that are coming up with new ideas and new energy, but we've got over 40 years of work to build on. So you don't have to make some of the same mistakes a lot of us did many times over. We can learn from the past and we can improve it. If we had an answer to what we would do to prevent it, we wouldn't be sitting here. We've got a lot of ideas and we've got a lot of pathways. It's not one easy it. It's a multiple pathway of activity that needs to happen ultimately to prevent child sexual abuse. So we need a broad range of leaders, of disciplines and perspectives coming into this. We also need to continue to expand that cross-discipline training. So as a preventionist, I felt like it was very important that I knew as much as I could about treating those that had been victimized and advocating for them, about treating those who did the sexual harm, and about the research that talks about why they do that, about bystander research, about all different kinds of things we know about how to make systemic change and social change, about different lenses into prevention. To bring that into this field, we need to learn from each other. And if you're doing individual therapy, if you're in law enforcement, whatever, if you're a health provider, if you're a faith leader, whatever field you're in, it cannot be up to the preventionists alone, those that research it or do it full time, to make prevention happen. We all have a responsibility to take our knowledge and feed it into prevention. Plus, it can help. It certainly helps when you feel like you're not only treating the problem in one way or another, but you're doing something to feed ultimately the prevention of it so that less of us are needed in this discipline. Another piece that has a lot of controversy about it, but has been a passion of mine since the 90s, is what we can learn from the indigenous communities around the world that have practiced some form of what we now call in mainstream communities restorative justice or transformative justice and circles. And I've been interested in that more because I don't think our criminal justice system alone is the answer. One pathway that's needed, but as I've said many times, we need many more pathways. And that is because not all those who harmed wish to go through that kind of system or whatever chose to go through that system. It doesn't work for everybody. It's not even an option for everybody if there's not enough evidence to bring it forward. And yet there are ways also to use restorative practices to build communities, to prevent the harm, to heal from the harm, and to address accountability. Critical in that is that it's victim-centered. It starts from whether or not the person harmed wants to be involved and what that person needs. That there's an other way for a person to take accountability, and that we recognize that this is not just an issue between the person who did the harm and the person that was harmed, but there's a ripple effect to the people who know and love the person who did the harm and the people that know and love the person harmed, and to the communities that they're in. There's a lot more room for that to grow outside of and connected to our criminal justice system. We need more options to build community, to build the skills, to build social emotional skills. And this is not on the slide, but I think it's worth mentioning that in schools, it's not only an issue of having more consistent sexual abuse prevention education, but having social emotional learning. And many of our best programs like Committee for Children have changed to social emotional learning. Our kids need a core nutrition of social emotional skills. In a technology age where we're getting so much of our contact via technology and we're spending so much time on it, we really need to know how to connect with other people. We need to know how to be in our world, not always hooked up, virtual reality of where we're going. We need to know how to connect with human beings, not just get our sexual needs met in very toxic ways like pornography. We need those core skills, that core nutrition of social emotional learning to make the vitamins take, like safety education, sexual abuse prevention education. And we need ways outside of schools to give that information because our schools are overwhelmed with a lot of it. But technology affords the good news of other ways to teach, other ways to reach, other ways to engage. One of my disappointments is the project that I did for Just Beginnings Collaborative, a report on mapping child sexual abuse services and prevention in the United States and broader, was meant to be a technology platform, one place where everybody could go instead of needing to know an organization to find their website, to find what they do. If I cared about this issue, I could go one place and find out a lot about different programs that do services and different programs that do prevention. I could find ways to get actively engaged. I could find emerging research. I could talk about new resources. I could easily link without needing to know a certain amount of information already. Plus, it would show what exists. We need to use technology more. Also, to highlight the resources that are there. Early on, decades ago, that was easy. There wasn't much now. The challenge for new leaders, the challenge for new students, the challenge for existing professionals now is keeping up with all the information and learning what else is out there. We also have to challenge funders as we go into the future without setting everybody up to say, this is what I do that nobody else does in order to be funded. It's ridiculous. We should be building on what other people are doing. We should be connecting the dots between what other people are doing. We should look at how our work complements what others are doing. Another need is, once we've identified the emerging research, is we continue to put that into our work. That's hard for some people. If I've worked really hard to develop a prevention program, I don't want to be having to change that all because of new research or a new concept. And yet when we look at what we're learning in neuroscience about how our brains work, there's a social impact, there's an emotional impact, and there is a neurological reason that some of these behaviors are developing and practices are developing. The resiliency research, the research on positive youth development, what we all need in terms of developmental assets or protective factors to thrive and to function as good, positive human beings that know how to interact in a positive way. These are all important aspects of what we need to do to prevent child sexual abuse, and it's research we need to stay mindful of and build in. When you're focusing on a problem, it's easy only to focus on risk. And the research would tell us we actually get more out of building up protective factors than just reducing risk. So stay tuned. And resiliency, as the earlier research showed us too, there's a gene. So how do we know, how do we build on that research and how do we build that resiliency? I mentioned earlier, but as we go forward in the future, I hope there's more work to connect between a public health frame, a social justice frame, a criminal justice frame, that we find creative ways. It's so hard to stay up just on our own field, to stay in our own lane, to have our expertise in that it's just mind-boggling to take the time to read the other journals, to attend the other conferences, to have the conversations. But I think technology is a way that can help, and just being versed on these different approaches can help us be mindful of the strengths and limits of our own. So finally, when I think about the future, I remember when I was doing HIV AIDS work and education along with my sexual abuse prevention education, and I was living with a couple that were both living with HIV and were activists, and this was in the mid-'80s. So Archie, the man, was one of the first people on AZT, and one of the things when I was running around like a crazy person because I was so important and I had so much to do, and of course I had to be everywhere all the time, and I kept saying I'd have time later. And he looked at me and said, if not now, when? And he was saying that from a place of knowing that he had a very limited time span. And that's been profound to me. It was a profound shift in my own look at self-care, at the importance of keeping ourselves and our organizations healthy, but in a much broader sense to prevention. I would say, as somebody who has been at this for over 42 years, we've lost ground in some ways. We're having arguments that I thought we had won. We've gained in many other ways. But when we are so geared to reacting after harm is done to treat it or to prosecute it, we really just have a hard time going, if not now, when are we actually going to come together to prevent initial perpetration and to look at and address the social conditions that set it up, that set the stage for this to happen? When are we going to make the healthy choice the easy choice? Because we are not feeding a sexually toxic and sexually violent set of cultural norms and standards and practices? If not now, when? So my ask back to you as we're going forward into the future is, what is your role as an individual? What is your role as an organization, as a community? And that means, how are we going to speak up and speak out when we see harm? What is my role in prevention and my role in supporting an investment in preventing it? Thank you.